So, Gillian Ann, I really appreciate being on here. And one of the things I want to just jump right into, first of all, is really as Masters Fund, we are seeing this huge arbitrage right now with a lot of female founders. And what I think is so interesting is Masters Fund, you both as managing directors, managing partners of this fund, you are focusing a lot on the female world. And what's interesting is you and I know that in the VC world, female founders are only getting a small percentage, sub 2%, but yet they are outperforming their male counterparts. And what I think is so interesting, you both had a successful exit. Before we dive into all your thesis and the exciting things that are going on and the outsized return opportunities, what each one of you, and I'll start with Jillian, what was your story? What made you to find this and say, this is where I want to come. This is where I want to spend a lot of my time, energy, and effort to work with these female founders. Where did that come?
Say is this is the hill that I'm going to die on. There are other equities to be worked on, but we can't boil the whole ocean. Having been an entrepreneur for a long time, having been an entrepreneur with my eldest son, that was an honor and a privilege. But I also got to witness how the interaction was when there is gender diversity and gender equity in corporations. When I had my happy exit and Anne had a happy exit as well, and we decided to work together, that's when we kind of opened that Pandora's box. That's when we found out that women were getting about 2% of conventional venture equity. When we talk about venture capital, we really mean venture equity. So it was venture equity we were looking at. And yes, we came to it with ire, not on my watch. It was supposed to be easier when the next generation arrived, and clearly it wasn't. But we also did, as you noted, a great deal of research and found that there is this market anomaly that is women and venture capital. When there is diversity on the leadership team, we're finding that gender equity or gender diversity is the premium piece, if you will. It's half the world. It makes sense. But other diversities also support the kind of the speed with which a company can succeed, and of course the trajectory of how well it will succeed. So all of those things become important. What made us decide to do this, though, was a bit of ire, not on our watch.
Yeah, our journey actually started when we were both operators in our own companies. Gillian raised and scaled a software company from 2 to 200 people. An evaluation, I think, of 100 million, I believe, Gillian. And then she took a partial exit about the time that I had an opportunity with a company I was serving on the board of to exit the digital agency that I had started. And I had built a worldwide consortium of small digital agencies. So we had these perfectly intersecting skill sets. She was software, I was services. We both know how to operate a company, grow a company. And we've been working together 10 years. Masters Fund is just 5 years old, but the journey from when we decided to work together until how we formed Masters Fund had a lot of ire. It also was a natural progression for us because we were working with a lot of entrepreneurs, and because that's our happy space. We are a couple of moms. I'm actually a grandma, and we love to help and coach and help things grow. And so that was our work together. And we found in the early days that the companies that we wanted to work with couldn't afford us. And that's when we began to say why. And why was that they weren't getting funded. And along the way, and it wasn't particularly gender specific at that time, but along the way, we began to discover just how, if it's bad for men entrepreneurs, it is way worse for women entrepreneurs, and even way, way worse for women and men of color entrepreneurs. And so we said this needs changing, and that's when we began to dig into, well, how? We're not going to change the way it works in Silicon Valley. We're just not. But we sensed that it was a ripe moment to begin to lead an evolution of venture capital. And we are joined by many colleagues going down the same route as we are about how do we better serve these entrepreneurs who are not among the tall, white, 30-something guys with baritone voices that went to Harvard and Stanford. So how do we better serve all the others? Because honestly, that's where the innovation's coming from women and persons of color and people in non-popular VC geographic areas like the Midwest. There is so much out there. And then the good news is there's so little competition for the deals. So that makes it very appealing.
So let's kind of dive into this because on your website, masters.vc, you share a thing that's really incredible. Morgan Stanley noted 4.4 trillion in missed opportunity by excluding women and minorities from VC funding, which is incredible. And you mentioned, and Gillian, you both mentioned, where when you were kind of evolving into unpacking all this data in this whole ecosystem. And I'd love to unpack that data specifically when you start like unpack things. And Gillian, you and I had a great conversation offline, but where kind of the certain things that were like really surprising, like, wow, I didn't realize this. And you start looking at all the funding, and there were certain schools, right, that were just kind of prevalent where all the capital was going to, and you had to do all this stuff. And so I wanted to get your response, and I'll start with you, Anne. When you're looking at the data, what were some really surprising things? You're like, oh my gosh, I see these patterns, and I see this arbitrage, and I see these things going on. And I'll go to you, Gillian.
The first thing that jumped out at us is actually the punchline. Leadership teams with women on board return 35% more value to shareholders, and that's true in the public markets and the private markets. And so that really is the first thing that came across my radar years ago. I said, well, that's interesting. The Morgan Stanley report is that's got whiskers on it now. I think that's 5 or 6 years old, that data. So it's, but it hasn't changed. It's still a missed opportunity. There are many, many more factors. And Gillian, you list these so well. I think you should do this one, and then we can jump back into it.
Yeah. 98% of capital goes to guys, but more than 2/3 of it goes to tall, white, American spoken, youthful, slender, able-bodied males from Harvard or Stanford, just 2 universities in the entire planet, with a baritone voice. And everything, including the baritone voices, points off if you don't have it. That's astounding. As an investor, I would say that's an overinvested space, right? But the question is begged, why does that happen? And I think you and I talked about this offline, Christian, and we should share it. It turns out this is vestigial behavior, right? Different is dangerous. And it always has been. All right. Humans are comfortable with humans like themselves. And that is vestigial, anthropological, if you will, behavior, right? If a humanoid infant had cozied up to a saber-toothed tiger some 30,000 years ago, it didn't last long. It instinctively had to cozy up to its own kind. And all humans do the same. All right. We have even had studies as early as, I think, or as late as, 2012, 2013, something like that, in which human infants were tested to see where they would root, which means to turn their faces to learn from and observe, right? And they do so more clearly with their own race than with any other race. Infants at 2 and 3 months are not, racist. They are following this instinctive behavior to learn from humans of their own kind. Now, that's fine, except that it no longer serves the planet in 2023. So the question is begged, how do we deal with that? Okay. And also it's notable that it is not only humans, it's all mammals and all the birds that fly in flocks and all our fish swim in schools and the plants on our planet grow in clusters. It's a survival mechanism of a carbon-based life form. So now we can remove this requirement to shout at somebody here or there, do better. They are doing what they're supposed to do. So the money must flow from different hands to get to different hands. We must welcome more investors of a very broad nature to engage in investing to all parties.
So let's talk about the statistical advantages that we discovered.
Oh, that's fun.
To begin with, and jump in anytime if I miss one. There's quite a list here. The first one is that when a woman and a man pitch the same deck, and the Swedes did this study for us, they sent out a woman and a man with the same deck around to pitch it. The woman comes back with an 84% lower valuation. Or a 16% valuation of what the guy gets. In other words, if he got if he got $1 million, she gets 1 point.
If he got 10 million,
sixth of that, 16th of that.
Right.
Anyway,
so
16%. That means there's an 84% discount on the initial investment.
That's right. If he gets a 10 million pre-money valuation offer, she'll get 1.6.
Exactly.
Right? It's astounding, right? So as an investor, we must ask, did you just tell me that I could get an 84% discount on my initial invested capital based on the human body standing in front of me? It's the exact same deck. It's the exact same company. Astounding. And they did it again and again and again, right? We move forward from there after the valuation is gotten. And that's, if they get that 2% of venture capital, right? If they get through that Series A, when all of these numbers really apply, by the way, it's at the Series A, when investors are looking at the team, not the numbers. By Series B, it's kind of all over but the shouting. If the numbers indicate that the company is going to not just thrive, but scale and then have inflection and, has demonstrated inflection, that's when the Series B and C and D and so on come in. All right. But at the Series A, they're betting on a team. So after we get to the 16% of pre-money valuations, the women are very capital efficient. In the similar industries, right? So it's different across industries. It's about an average of 44% of capital raised by men. So as an investor, you must ask, did you just tell me 54% less dilution every time you, or say 56%, right? Less dilution. Every time you raise a buck, I get diluted. I know it's not 1-to-1 and this and that, but this is significant, right? And women will gain, what is it? They will yield 2.5 times the revenue that a guy yields when, for the same invested dollar. So that's significant, especially in our investment model over at Masters Fund, because our first investment is made with a redeemable warrant. And so we are looking at those gross revenues, gross margins, stability in terms of capital markets and so on.
See, I wanted to highlight those specific things because it's just so important. I want to foot stomp on what you're saying here. You get a 2.5 return more than a male counterpart. They're more efficient with the little bit of capital they do have access to, but also, like you mentioned, and I love that data point specifically. Everything else is equal except the gender. And the females get a lower valuation just because of the gender. Everything else is equal. And that just blew my mind when you were mentioning that, of course, and just certain things that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. But like you mentioned, coming back on the efficiency, right? You're seeing, okay, hey, less investors, obviously the more pie, the larger the pie I have, right? Non-dilutive, right? Which is a beautiful thing for a lot of investors. And I'm curious because I want to dive into this. You mentioned, and I want you talked about obviously kind of that debt to equity structure a little bit. And this is actually something I found so unique in the way you actually really partner in a very synergistic way with your founders to make sure that obviously you're able to hit that. And the incentives in the VC world, it's sad. Typically, the incentives with the investors and the founders, they tend not to align. But you guys have been able to establish it where it's actually aligned perfectly with everybody's goal in that North Star. So I'd love for you to just unpack that, whichever one would like to take that question.
Well, I like to remind a lot of our founders that the venture capitalists, conventional venture capital firms, they're in business to make money for their investors. That may not and frequently does not align with the goal of somebody starting a company where they want to build a great product and grow it. Two different alignment. The alignment is so key. And the reason that we came up with a different model is because a different off ramp, if you will, is because that alignment is very hard to get to when the conventional venture capital firm, they want the most expeditious sale at the highest valuation possible because that's how they get paid. And when we drilled into that, we said, that's what needs changing for all the other people. We don't believe, well, you may know that only fewer than 4% of all conventionally venture funded startups have a happy exit. That means more than 96% do not and return nothing to the investors. We really discarded the notion that the VCs made a mistake on 96% of their investments. We don't think that's true. So that's why we came up with a model that addressed how do we do what you just said, partner with our firms, our founders to help them build profitable and quite possibly mid-cap businesses in wherever they are in their communities, and then build community support. So that's the why of what we did. The how, I'll leave to Gillian.
So yeah, in terms of kind of unpacking this notion that venture equity is the only kind of venture capital, right, is, an important piece. It sucks all the oxygen out of the room, as Anne is often fond of saying. But it is not the only way to capitalize the growth of privately held companies, right? So in venture capital, right, all venture equity is venture capital, but not all venture capital is venture equity. We should be looking at venture debt options as well as hybrid models also, right? In doing so, we are able to capitalize a broader group of companies, see more of them survive, and provide off-ramps so that these companies can return a reasonable ROI to the investors in a reasonable period of time. The golden triangle, if you will, the thing we all look for is 3x to the investors. Right? And if you can determine how to do that with a fund structure and investment model or models, as we have both this kind of venture debt and venture equity model, then that's the way you should flow. It isn't only one way. We talk a lot about the rewards of venture capital. We don't talk enough about the risks, right? VCs didn't make a mistake on 96% of their investment decisions, right? These are the finest companies on the planet, but the investment model is to invest in about 20 companies in which you burn 18 or 19 and the 20th has a meteoric exit so large that it covers all of the expenses of the fund, all of the losses, and returns the 3x. This is the investment model, and it is well suited to companies that are building, if you will, the foundational technologies that will power the human existence for the coming decades. It is not so well aligned with companies that would leverage that technology to build the next very decent thing. And so, with early investments in more of a venture debt model, right, in which we have something called a redeemable preferred warrant that looks like a convertible note or a safe, but in those instruments, it says this is not redeemable. In ours, it says it is redeemable. This provides us an opportunity to return to the fund investors capital from companies that can go off and become privately held mid-cap corporations, right? We don't lose those to the fund. At the same time, those company leaders can buy back their stock, right? I buy it for 1, they buy it for 3, that kind of thing. The warrant is the vehicle by which this money transfers, right? In that, they can buy that stock back at 3x what was lent to them, if you will, right? They take the capital, they use it, they grow the company, and at such time as the company achieves a monthly recurring revenue that is sufficient to redeem this warrant using a revenue share model, they do so. And at that point, they have choices. They can recapitalize that stock, selling it to a later stage investor, and recapitalize the growth of their company, or they can pocket that stock and go on and become privately held. Providing nuance in investment is a critical element to the evolution of venture capital.
How did that evolve? Because I was such an unorthodox when we talked offline. It was such an unorthodox way of thinking. Just like and you mentioned the typical VC that they just don't structure it that way at all. It's not aligned with a lot of the investors versus with the founder and the founding team. And so I just love to unpack like the way you thought about it, where it was like this holistic kind of approach and this synergy, and say, hey, you know what? What's actually best for the founder? What's best for us? And how do we align interests? I just think that's so cool. Was it an evolution, or was it outside partners that work with you in regards to the structure?
Right.
Yes and yes.
In 1946, Georges Doriot, a French-born American professor at Harvard, formed ARD with his buddies. They were going to invest in companies being formed by the GIs coming home after the Second World War. They had some pretty good ideas about the technologies that would power this human existence on planet Earth for the next century. Massive ideas, tremendous risk, and tremendous reward. They wrote white papers about it, and they thought 2% of their investments would pan out. Turns out they'd almost doubled it to 4, right? Pretty cool, right? They're pretty, what is it, 3.8 N or 3.87 something? I mean, it's pretty close to 4%. Pretty cool. But it was not designed for every startup on the planet. Our problem is not with conventional venture capital. It does what it's supposed to do, but it was not, again, designed for every company, and that's all we're slathering over every company. We came to it as entrepreneurs. And again, as Anne says, we're moms. We were anomalies in our own field of technology. So we got to know one another and be friends, and that was great. But most of this was a game played by children out of college, barely. Right. And they would come to us, I've got snuffles, my airline ticket doesn't work. Would you sit on my board? Would you listen to my business plan? Right. Because we were listening. So we got a kind of a bench of so many companies in a particular field of technology. That's fine. And then that broadened over time. So with, again, about a decade under our belt of thousands of companies that we have reviewed, we see these patterns of the inability to raise capital between that angel series or stage and getting to at least the seed, if not the Series A. Right? There's kind of this hole for everybody. We've got the product, but nobody wants to pay to go see if we can expand the market. So we saw a hole there for everyone, and then we saw this particular hole around diverse founders of all varieties. And again, the hill that we will die on is gender equity, and we will trust our colleagues to work on additional equities as well. And certainly we collaborate with them to invest in companies where we can support greater diversity of leadership. I do think that the world suffers, if you will, from a lack of that balance of input from most of the people on the planet. Right? If we can solve for that, we can solve more problems, and we can bring greater stability. Literally, as Anne says, we work on world peace because that is how you bring peace to a community of humans, right? Providing access to the benefits of living in a society. And that's
Yes,
what
and
we're
we
hoping.
believe that is our purpose. Our mission is to bring equity in funding and entrepreneurship,
Mhm.
gender equity. Our mission is world peace, because if you have prosperous
There you go.
communities, that
Yeah.
cuts back on a lot of the strife, the strife over resources. To go back to your question about how we actually formulated this model, um, at the time that we began to realize that there needed to be a new model, there were companies coming up in something called venture debt. And we have several colleagues who operate in that. And we looked at that and we said, that's not exactly where we want to go for a number of reasons, not least of which is the tax implications to us of taking debt interest. And we also realized our venture debt colleagues were investing at a later stage. Gillian mentioned the product and this, what a lot of people refer to me as the valley of death. And I think that's because it's very easy to get enthusiastic about a new product or service, and it's very easy to raise angel capital and family and friends capital with that enthusiasm. Then you get the product to the market and you say, okay, now I need money for marketing and the business. And everybody goes, huh? I don't want to pay for that. And that we saw this across the board with our early investments, our what you might call angel investments in the first few years. And we said, that's interesting. I also noted that we weren't the only ones thinking like that. Um, was a fund I was aware of in Philadelphia where I was spending a few years, where a very large fund had started another fund the same size as ours to fund that particular gap for companies, entrepreneurs in India. He is Indian American. So we thought, okay, that's interesting. And we watched the venture debt. Along the way, we came across more than one person in particular who was talking about structured exit. And we said, okay, that's interesting. What is a structured exit? Well, it's exactly what we do. We say, we're going to invest this, and you're going to exit on a schedule of this. And so it's an equity play, because at any time we can convert to equity if we choose to. That is in our documents. So it's an equity play, but it works like a debt play. And then we take earlier risk than our debt fund colleagues who want to see 2 or 3 years of revenues at a certain level and start getting repayment within sometimes 30 days, sometimes 90 days. Whereas we say when you meet a certain threshold of monthly revenues, then we will start taking a percentage of your gross interest. It averages 6%. Some are 4, some are 8. Every deal is bespoke to our particular founders. And when they reach that level, then they begin to pay us, and until it's paid off. What's interesting, we thought when we modeled this out, and we use a very intricate financial model to figure this out. Another great resource for us was a wizard financial modeler who is our head of modeling. And what we thought was that it would take 3 to 5 years. Half of our portfolio is easily a year ahead of that. Now they are going to be redeeming in 2 to 4 years. This is exciting. It's sort of like, okay, it's like a plant. You water it, it grows. This is very simple stuff. So that's how we arrived at this model. We had a lot of support from financial people, from legal resources to make this work. But the idea that we came up with was to combine the best qualities of debt and the best qualities of equity to the benefit of both us and our founders and our investors.
Right.
Incredible,
Mutually
incredible the way.
beneficial investment agreements, I think, are the hallmark of what we were focused on. It was, if you will, what we wanted as entrepreneurs, and that carried over when we became investors.
Which is incredible to see that holistic, because you guys were both, I mean, both ladies were founders. And so you understand what they go through. And that's one of the reasons why you structure it. And also just kind of, double click on what you just mentioned. It's actually a lot faster than you were anticipating in regards to your projections, which is actually
Get
a good
into your
news.
job.
Yeah, which is always good. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you're unpacking it, because you mentioned some of the phases a little bit in regards to way you think about this stuff. And I always love to talk about kind of the investment thesis and the underwriting process, because that's very imperative. And definitely when you're doing kind of debt, the debt is structured slightly different. It's normally backed by either IP or obviously some sort of hard assets, et cetera, to be able to then kind of justify it. And then of course you mentioned the equity as well, and you clearly stated that when you both and the team are doing underwriting and the due diligence, not on just the team itself, but also kind of the financials, the total addressable market. I know on your website, again, masters.vc, you mentioned your expertise lies in B2B and B2C tech companies specifically, but sometimes you are out of that vertical sometimes. So I'd love for you to both maybe talk a little bit about the underwriting, the due diligence process for the team, as well as the actual product fit.
Well, at a macro level, the fund didn't stop, or we didn't stop, if you will, looking at mutually beneficial agreements and kind of rewards for all stakeholders with just the investment model itself. We looked at the fund structure in terms of people as well as finance. So we encourage new LPs to join the fund. Many times it will be their first fund investment. They may have been angel investors, or they may not have engaged in private corporate funding before at all. So in that, we are welcoming new investors. We welcome and specifically are intentional about seeking out people of color, specifically even women of color, and so on. These are people who are not usually asked to sit on boards of directors. Many of them are highly qualified. Our favorite is somebody who has just retired and looking at four walls after a very powerful career and wondering what to do next. We know what to do next. Take 4 board seats for us and help the next generation to build their companies. But seriously, though, what we looked at were the benefits to all the stakeholders. So the LPs do have access to board seats. Our job is to match them with a board that will really benefit from their service and enable them to give back. Secondarily, our VPs do the same, and they all bring, the VPs and the LPs and our colleagues, a network of which we have built many, many hundred already, they all bring value in terms of industry-specific knowledge and sector-specific knowledge. And so if we see that we have deep bench in a particular sector, we are able to invest in it. We can leverage the LPs as well as the VPs for that. And they all engage in due diligence. Our job is to teach them how that's done, to bring in their wisdom and also to educate them. Some of the folks investing at Masters Fund want to run their own funds. We're teaching them how it's done.
How important, I'm just curious in the structure and just on a data perspective, because a lot of VCs, they have like an internal team, or even like private equity, they have an internal team and then they use LPs money and it's very passive, right? LPs just deploy X amount of dollars and they don't really, engage the LPs. And what you're basically saying is that you're engaging the LPs. And a lot of times the LPs, they've had a successful exit in their own way, right? They've had success in their own way and they kind of know this. And I think I'm just curious, like, what are you seeing in regards to the synergy in leveraging the LPs, being very active in the board, as well as just kind of the advising for these companies, et cetera. I would love to
Mhm.
just talk a little bit about that because again, that's a differentiation according to
Yes.
like mainstream, and I think that's a very very key aspect of the way you
Well,
structure it.
we felt
Well, it was
again that it was an
simple.
underutilized asset, right?
Yeah, it
For
was
the
simple
LP.
math to begin with. If we're going to invest in our cohort of 100 companies, it is impossible for Gillian and I to sit on 100 boards. And right off the bat, or even for our 7 VPs, it still can't be done. And so we decided that with the math didn't work, we needed to look for a source of people to bring in. And then we began to see, oh gosh, this really serves everybody's purposes,
Mhm.
especially our LPs coming in. So we have very engaged LPs who want to do this kind of work. Most of them, some don't. Some were just happy to passively write us a check. That was great. But many of them want to be involved. And indeed, we have some of them right now are even working on the due diligence with our more experienced VPs to help them understand. And we turned down one company, and it was the LP who said, "No, I don't see a business here." I mean, she was right on it, just like that. And so we are beginning to engage them in that process as well. The idea is, in addition to funding 100 companies and raising $100 million, we would like to see 100 more funds like ours out there. We think of ourselves as the spider plant. We put out these little shoots and then they grow. So this is that's sort of the thought behind it. What we are finding is that then that puts us in the position of we have to provide cohesive and comprehensive information to them, training, if you will, so that because we're very interested in seeing competent board governance. We have seen too many companies all through our 10 years together, and even before that, where the wrong board can sink a company just like that. And frequently, the early investors who come on and board members are not appropriate 3 to 5 years down the line. And so we are very interested in seeing the board members make a board governance that makes sense to the way we think boards should be run. Now, if you think about 100 companies, all with the same value in board governance, that's a pretty powerful thing, especially if they're all connected through each other and they can help
Mhm.
each other's companies, with a problem or a resource, or additional funding from a funding source. So
Mhm.
it's that is how we came at that, and that's why we have very engaged LPs.
Yep.
Incredible. What I find I would love to see where long term compared alpha apple to apple compared to other kind of firms, the relationship in regards to your outsized return. And the reason why I say this is because I guarantee you when you activate your LPs, it's just totally different when you own it, right? As an LP, as an investor, you come across and say, hey, these are my companies, these are my founders, these are my people, right? And it's just like a psychological different when instead of hiring someone from Stanford, they're in your VC and then they work on this portfolio company and they're supposed to
Right.
be advising them. And it's just a different kind of synergy. And so I'd love to see that kind of result. And I think I guarantee that there probably will be a massive, just massive alpha in regards to that. When I also want to ask on this, so this is what I always find interesting. There's different stages to this, of course, in the evolution. And you guys, like we mentioned, you had this beautiful synergy with the founder and the company and the founding team. You both have come from incredible marketing backgrounds and experience and operators. And as a VC, we see different VCs where they have like their kind of their their weight that they pull around. Some have big Rolodex that they can, corporate clients, enterprise, boom, all of a sudden make an intro, and now you got another $5 million top line, right? Just because they can open up that door. Some are very heavy on other different verticals, right? And some have like different incubators. I'm curious with your kind of approach, definitely working with the LPs, but also as the Masters Fund team. What do you feel like is is one of your North Star, the thing that you bring to the table the most? Obviously, the female founder and so forth, and whatever in the process, but as in connection with that, with the founding team.
Right. Well, this follow-on funding is a big deal, obviously, right? There will be companies that don't need further funding and they become privately held. That's fine. But for those companies who are moving on to that Series A, we need to make sure that they get there. And as they approach seed and Series A investors, our job has been to establish a network of hundreds of other funders who are willing to look at companies with a broad diversity in the founding team. And that's, if you will, a subset of VCs. We recognize that. Many VCs talk about, well, it's deal flow, it's this, it's that, we don't see whatever. We are still making connections to those VCs, but we also had to do it, if you will, mindfully. Women who are in the decision-making role are 3 times, so 300% more likely to invest in any diversity on the founding team. And we're able to refer folks to those kinds of VCs where the decision makers are broad in themselves, right? They are either people of color, of all genders, and so on, or they have some other affinity to the sector, etc. So it's our job to create that, and we've spent the last 5, 6 years doing that. It wasn't as easy as saying, "Oh, I had an Apple size exit." No, we had smaller exits. We had fine exits, but they were not of the meteoric size. So we weren't immediately, if you will, inducted into that group where you could make a phone call and get millions and millions instantly. We had to build it. We did the hard work, and we've done so. And yeah, it's a little, it is always more work, if you will. The check sizes will be smaller than 50 million or 100 million. It will take several follow-on investors to get where people are going, but we've still done the work. That's how it works.
And the Rolodex, one of the things I'd like to point out about Gillian and me is that in all of our roles over decades, we were in one form or another of fiduciary leadership. That didn't mean we were finance people. It meant we were in charge of managing finance people. And
Mhm.
that leads me to what is we both recognize is our superpower, is the ability to attract talent in whatever space we need. Gillian did it at Moz. I did it at my digital agency to attract the talent that will build it. And then a core piece of leadership is enabling your team to have the resources to get the job done for you and then letting them do it. And that has been our mutual philosophy. This is quite possibly one of the many reasons we get along so well as partners, other than we like each other, is that we both believe that that is our core function. It is not to sit at the top of the mountain and direct everything. It is to enable everybody else, all the talented people we bring into our organization, to produce at their highest and best level. And
Right. And that would
that's how we
speak
do
to
it.
the training that we do. We train folks, the LPs, for example, and the VPs in board governance. And we have somebody in our VP group who is leading the development of those training modules. And then we have information for, again, the LPs and how to bring in deal flow, how to recognize deal flow, and so on. And then for those people who want to start their own fund, we are doing that kind of training. Awful lot of what we do is sharing of knowledge acquired over a great deal of time, and also acquiring that knowledge ourselves, knowing who to ask when we don't have answers, and being pretty straightforward. When we don't have an answer, we'll find it.
My
Humility is
very
key.
first job out of college was in an advertising department of a nuclear utility. And my first boss could have been Don Draper. His name was actually Dick Sullivan. And one of the first things he taught me was you don't have to know all the answers. You just have to know where to find them. And this was decades before there was even Yahoo, let alone Google. But that has been my philosophy. If I need an answer, I need to know where to find it, not to try and invent it myself.
Humility, humility. I think that's just so incredible. It just shows your character, your personality, but also the value that you bring in holistic with the relationship with the founders and the LP team as well. I want to kind of pivot because I'm curious. There's this saying, 80/20, right? The Pareto principle, right? Out of all the companies you invested, 80% will go to zero, or a portion will go to zero, a portion will, you'll
Mhm.
level off, and then a portion will actually, offset where it obviously makes some money and so forth. And I'm curious, Jillian, you mentioned this where you may not see those big, meteorite kind of explosions, right? However, though, it's those small singles, right? It's the consistent singles. And I'm curious, just as a fun approach and perspective, are you noticing that there's kind of an outlier where you may be seeing, kind of a 40-60 split where it's like, okay, we're actually seeing a little bit better results just because just the way we structure it and that we're aligned with the actual company as well and just the synergies behind it. I'd love to just talk a little bit about that, what you're
Um,
seeing.
it's a little early to say we've got a decade worth of this. We don't, but we are beginning to see that we have a far better shot at flipping that 20-80 rule. Right, 80% of all VC companies die within 5 years, so on and so forth. We have a pretty good shot at flipping that, and that's because again we give them an off ramp. Right? So they don't have to do more than say, if you double your revenue year over year, this is insufficient, right, for a conventional venture equity investment to say this is inflection. It's not going to become that globally, impactful VC type win, right? But it is perfectly sufficient for a company that will increase in value, hire more people, and be stable, and so on. So we are seeing that, but we don't have hard numbers yet. You'll have to come back to us in about 2 years, and then we'll have our first numbers for you. And hopefully, over time, we will be able to prove that the survivability of the companies that take on non-dilutive investment early and work their way out of it, focusing on the business of building a business, not the business of building the product only. All of those things, right? All of the elements we bring to it with Masters Fund, we hope we will be able to prove in a decade that many, many more survive.
I'm glad you mentioned singles because what
Mhm.
we are playing is Moneyball. We're going for the base hits. And out of our investments, out of the 80% that survive, we project that there will be 6 to 10% that will be the ones that are worthy of follow-on investments to make that meteoric exit. And because we will have been close to them for 3 to 4 years on their boards, guiding them, helping them build. And so we will have a really good idea and we will be collecting a lot of data. We already have started collecting data on their increase in revenues, their monthly revenues, because that's how we get paid. So we care desperately about that. But
Sure.
also their ability to raise more capital, how many people they're hiring, all of that. And they, as we collect more of that data, we will be able to look develop really good overviews of what are the success factors, truly. And
What's causative and what's correlative is very important.
yes.
I'd love for you to explain that a little bit in regards to what you just mentioned there. I think that's an important piece, Jillian. So the correlation aspect of it.
Yeah. Again, we had this crack in the universe, if you will, in 1994 when the web showed up. And we had another crack in the universe in April, just March and April of 2023. I guess it started in about November of 22 and so on. It was the democratization and commoditization of machine learning and AI. Now we all get to play with it, right? And certainly there are many different types of applications there. But one of the most powerful is our ability to track thousands of data points, to amplify our human mind's capacity to do these things. So the question is, for example, I have a company in the health tech sector, and it acquires 4 customers in 4 months since it launched its first product, and another one that acquired 8 within 4 months. Is that correlative or causative to the fact that we're going to see, the company number 2 go to a very high exit and the company number 1 might not even thrive? Is it nonsense? Is it in the noise level? Where we wouldn't follow such things usually, right? We can follow 1,000 or more such tiny little bits of information. And over time, as we share that not only with ourselves but our colleagues, right, that information in general will say, oh, these are the signals. These are the signals of high performing companies. This kind of a company is going to need this kind of capital, and that kind of a company needs another kind. Imagine that. If you could get the capital into a company at the right time with the right type of capital, wow, you could have a whole lot more things solved, a whole lot more companies thriving, and many more people being employed by those companies at the regional level, not just focusing on, of course, the unicorn. It's just one type of equity investment.
What I think is so interesting what you're saying, and this is one of the things that I'm so glad we're having you on, both of you on, because it's so fun where you're leveraging a lot of the data and leveraging AI and ML, machine learning, to be able to
Mhm.
detract all this information, shove it into this machine learning and kind of, AI structure and this data sets to then be able to identify those patterns, because it really affects the holistic aspect of the portfolio company. Because now what happens, not only when you're deploying capital as well on the front end, now obviously you're able to identify those patterns very quickly and efficiently. And then also, like you mentioned, on the follow-on checks as well, because sometimes, we're human. We like to measure and focus on certain KPIs, but at the end of the day, that may evolve depending upon obviously how much data that we actually have access to. And so once we start seeing those patterns, it's like, wow, all of a sudden the efficiencies, the 80-20 rule, like we were just talking about, could just totally be upside down in a positive way, right?
That's,
And
that's
so,
right.
yeah, I think it's very exciting to see how Masters Fund is able to run point guard on this and really seeing that evolution and just jumping on like that whole saying. I always hate to say it, but I mean it's so true. You got to skate to where the puck is going, and you both and the team know where it's going, and you are running for it, which is really excellent. I
Mhm.
want to ask, so when we're looking at this, because I think this is important to always ask. I always love to ask this because there's always those tough conversations, right? Definitely with the founders and so forth, right? Where, hey, we're not gonna keep investing our time, energy, and effort. Sadly, right? Those are those situations where what, our time. However, you got to focus. At the end of the day, we only have X amount of bandwidth, and we have to focus our time, energy, and effort on things that are producing, right? Double, triple, quadruple our time on things that are actually making really amazing results. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about navigating those conversations, because I think that's always important, right? And definitely with the founding team, because that is tough as a VC and that relationship. But at the end of the day, really how to mitigate that risk on the back end, but also make sure that you depart in a mature and in a respectful manner, and been able to focus as Masters Fund, focusing on the big things that are actually producing results, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say that for example, with Fund One, it's a fairly small fund. So we had a number of investments there. And what we found is those companies where we were deeply engaged, either we or VP or LP and so on, they did better, much better. They thrived more quickly and so on and so forth. But that turned out to be a good match, not only with a personality, but with the goals of the founders at the investment level. So we're going to have a whole lot fewer conversations about we're not going to continue with you if we get better pre-investment.
Mhm.
Right. And that is maybe the biggest learning we had from Fund One, kind of our proof of concept fund. When a founder was ready to jump in and build their board of directors immediately, to seat it with their independence, to focus on this business of building a business, and wanted the advisory services offered by Masters Fund, this very deep engagement, it was a good match. And when they kind of gave it lip service, and we should have seen the signals and did not, right, then they disengaged. It wasn't even us who said, yeah, we're not going to follow on. They disengaged pretty quickly. They just wanted a few bucks and they were going to go off and do their thing. And now we are left, as so many conventional venture equity funds, hope for it, right? That's not a good thing for our model, right? And we did have a company inside our Fund One that did that. We are kind of pulling her back into the fold, if you will, bit by bit and getting to it. But she's months behind in the focus on building the business from a more holistic way. She was focused on sales, but if you will, in a mode of desperation, rather than saying, no, let me take your wisdom. How do I do this? How do we build channel partnerships and, right? So in that, she went racing off on her own. That was not a good solution. And I find too many early stage CEOs or senior leadership teams, male, female, of all backgrounds, they're doing that. They're racing off on their own rather than having the support of folks who have done it before. So
One of the things
doing
I
our job
noticed,
before means
yeah,
less
one
of
of the
these
things
discussions.
we both noticed in probably 1,000 or more companies and founders we've talked to over the years is every one of them was well versed in their product. Many of them were engineers or other vertical product focused people. So, of course, their next impulse is promoting their product and selling their product. And none of them had a clue on how to build a business around it,
Mm.
unless they were lucky enough to have a good executor on board. We look for wizards and executors. You need both. The wizard is the visionary that makes the new thing that's going to make the perfectly decent thing that's going to change the world. But somebody has to execute on the wizard's vision. And the successful companies are the ones that have both qualities in them. That said, they still may be product focused. And it's interesting to me that so many of the pitches we get and the updates we get from companies that would like to be in our portfolio, they're all about sales. There's nothing about how am I building the business around this. And that is where our alignment is. You need to build a business if this product's going to get where it's going to go. I mean, that's like
Right.
intuitive. And that's what we know how to do. And that's the expertise we bring. And the what we call leadership advisory comes with our investment. And that's a part of the package. And as Gillian pointed out so clearly, it's so clear to us now that the people who engage with that are thriving, and the people who don't are they're not thriving
Hmm.
yet.
Generally, when we do have to have that hard conversation, either pre or post, and most of ours have been pre now, investment, it is about focusing on your financial model, the projections, understanding the actual costs of acquisition of customers, your ability to scale, the creation of channel partnerships, where you will be getting product from if this is a hard product, and so on. So, your supply lines, all of those kinds of things. And as we encourage them to focus on these things, those that are ready to dive into them are a good match. Those that are pushing against it and just wanting to, run by the seat of their pants, if you will, they will have a much harder time scaling. That would not be a good match.
One of our star companies is in the beverage industry.
Yeah.
Now, we started with tech. Now we say we fund women led innovation because they innovated sparkling waters to have adaptogens in them that are good for you and that actually taste good. Well, they were brought to us by one of our very first venture partners and investors. And he was very enthusiastic about them. And we said, well, what do we know about beverage? We're from tech and marketing and, some finance. What do we know about beverage? And they kept coming back and saying, we know about the beverage. We need what you know about how to build the business. And in fact, we always do a SWOT on companies that we're investing. We did one on ourselves for this company. And it has turned out to be an incredible relationship. They are blowing and going. They are just doing great things. They've doubled their revenues already this year. They will move them to tripling very shortly next year. They are really doing a great job, and we're learning about the beverage industry, which we didn't know about. And
So the
so this
support
has
we've
been
brought,
a
yeah, the
wonderful
support
experience
we brought to
for all of us.
yeah. The support we brought to this beverage company, by the way, was in a kind of how to raise capital, how to focus on, which kind of investors are most likely to do that, how to prepare themselves for M&A. They're going to get there pretty darn quickly. And they taught us how they get to M&A, slaying more dragons by, being in this shop or the next one and the next level until they get ready. But other things, they ran into an insurance issue as if something went wrong with a batch of this or that, helping them to understand how to negotiate these things so that everybody comes out whole. They did a brilliant job. All of those things are about the business of building and operating a business, having nothing to do with their product. Those are the values that we bring to the company, and when they're ready, it's a good match.
It's very refreshing to hear that, definitely in the VC world. I see so many times where it's a small checks and a lot of different companies because they're just playing the law of large numbers, that 80-20 rule. And the thing is, they just don't have the time and they don't put the energy to work with their founding team at a very holistic level. And I just love that story where you're able to say, hey, we're not familiar with this industry per se, but we can bring the incredible operation experience and the business acumen that we
Yeah.
have to be able to facilitate to make sure that you're able to deploy. And they came in humbly and said, "Hey, we need your help," which is awesome. I just think the synergy behind that is just so beautiful, and how you all are as a team take a very active position and a role in each one of these and leveraging a lot of your LPs. I think that's just so huge, and I just want to reiterate that and double click on that because I think it's just so important. Definitely in the VC world, you don't hear that a lot. I've heard very sad stories where it's, "Hey, we wrote a check, never heard from them since." It's just like, what in the world? Here's an incubator training thing online or whatever. And so I just want to talk about that. Let me ask you this also, because you mentioned this where it's building efficiency businesses. And I think this is actually very interesting because I'm a big believer in sometimes when you build constraints in businesses, you're able to get more creative, right? If you're always just relying on cash and we're going to go raise another $10 million, you're just diluting your position as an investor, but also it's just like you're burning the crap out of cash. And for what reason, right? I think it's just a perfect example. We just saw an incredible company. It was a $1 billion valuation, gone, done, because they were burning cash. They didn't actually work profitable. It wasn't efficient business, right? So sometimes this mindset, and I'm actually excited to see how, because there's less capital being deployed toward female, they have to put these constraints on. It's a bad situation, and it's terrible to be in that, but it also helps them get very creative and build efficiency and efficient businesses. And I just want to ask you on what you're seeing, just kind of a compare and contrast with those companies that are just burning the crap out of cash, burn at all costs, let's grow at all costs, more so than saying, "Hey, you know what, let's actually build an efficient business. Let's go to market strategy. And actually, are we actually getting money and sales, et cetera, because we have to rely on this," and so forth. So, just the importance of talking
Very
about
different
that.
kinds of businesses being built. The question is often begged, do women not get the venture capital money because they're not building scalable corporations? Or they're not building scalable corporations because they're not getting the money? One or the other, right? And in that, we do find that many women, not all, but many women are looking at their businesses in different ways. And the capital efficiency is, it's causative. They're not getting the money, so they have to be capital efficient. But many of them are also not asking for more. Right? Again, they're raising less capital because they're seeing those efficiencies. They're also, I think, looking at conventional venture equity-backed companies as not necessarily a company that they are comfortable building. I don't know if they don't want to this or that and so on. They're not comfortable building it in that way. I think they're looking more holistically at the corporate, landscape, and understanding how few companies actually make it to a meteoric exit by burning massive amounts of capital, acquiring millions and then billions of customers, right? And being one of those unicorns. But it's informative to remember that since 1946, when venture capital was invented as we know it today, right, since it launched, it took until February of 2022 for the world to see 1,000 unicorns. That's an awful lot of time and a tremendous amount of capital that went into creating 1,000 unicorns. Your chances of getting there are pretty darn slim. That's not the 4%. The 4% is just 3x or better to investors. That's just mid-cap, right? That's not huge. So in understanding that, even if you're playing at the higher levels and you're investing, $1 billion and you get the 3 billion back, again, it's still a 3x exit. Okay, so in doing so, I think that we are seeing that the women are looking at their companies differently. They're looking at their capitalization differently, and they're looking at the stability of the finance much earlier than all male teams. And perhaps that is part of that balance of a gender balanced team. This focus on how much can we accomplish, how quickly, and how much can we accomplish capital efficiently. Both of these pieces are being looked at. There's an advantage to speed in the market, right? This concept of first to market is actually a fallacy, right? The first to markets tend to fall on their noses. Exactly what position was Google before it dominated the planet, for example, as a unicorn in its field? There were a few that came before who are no more, and many who are just meh also ran. I mean, I don't know, Bing has 3% of the market or something? I don't know. It's tiny, right? It was not the first. It was not even the second. Many of these things could be replicated if you look at separate industries and who really succeeded. So first to market, a bit of a fallacy. The speed to market. Yes, there's always 5 bright guys doing what you're doing right behind you, and you don't even know they're there. And one or more of them may get a great deal of funding and you may not. The question is, what will you accomplish and where will your business sit in the ecosystem? Again, we are finding that there's a bit more pragmatism among the women in that leadership team in understanding where they are likely to sit and then the hope of breaking out of that as well. But they look at both pieces. They do not run, if you will, kind of against everything into the dark, right? In the hope that saying, well, we're definitely going to break out of that not just mid cap, but even the higher mid cap. We're definitely going to break out of it. Just keep throwing money at it. At some point, they say, no, we have to adjust and thrive. There's a real difference between that and kind of all odds and bust. I'd say that would be very correlative, if you will, to the symbols of male and female, the mirror versus the arrow. Right? And when you have both on the leadership team, I think you can build some pretty darn good companies. They'll get perhaps larger faster, but they'll also hold in the reins to not explode the capital. Right? That's what we're seeing as the differences. And again, these are all glittering generalities. It's not every human, but we are seeing patterns.
Mm-hmm.
If you consider that not just in the U.S. but all over the world, the women control 80 to 85% of the household spending. I think there's a cultural element here. Now, that said, we believe both are necessary. We need the arrow and we need the mirror, both to succeed. It's the having the homogeneity that becomes a problem, is when you don't have the willingness to go forward and take risks and push the envelope a little, and then the willingness to put the constraints that you mentioned on. At a very simple level for Masters Fund, because we are paid back out of a percent of gross revenues, we care a lot about building profitable companies, which is a very different mindset from conventional venture capital, where they make their money on the big sale or the IPO. So that is why we can align with the founders' interests very well, because we want to see them succeed, because then we'll get paid.
We should point out that the leadership team at Masters Fund is also gender diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse, and so on. So, our VP team that supports us is also diverse.
You walk the talk, right? And that's so important.
Oh, yeah.
You walk the talk.
It was very important. And we find ourselves, how should I say, better informed because of it. I am always mindful on our weekly calls of the differences in perspective.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And sometimes it feels like herding cats, but the cats are all marvelous, each in their own specialty. And our job is to herd the cats, which I refer to what Gillian and I did in our operator days, herded a lot of cats. And that is, we consider that a joy. If we had it surrounded by people who agreed with us all the time, that would be counterproductive at best and destructive at its worst. So our origin story, which you may have had a chance to read, it was about a woman, Sibylla Masters, who developed a corn grinding machine in 1712, went to England to secure a patent from the king, and it took 3 years because the king sort of waffled around about it. The patent was awarded. It was the first patent awarded to any person in the colonies, and it was awarded to her husband, because in 1715, women themselves were property. They could not own property, much less invent something that would get patent. And that wonderful man, Thomas Masters, said, it's on the patent. He insisted it be written, a patent awarded to Thomas Masters for an invention found out by his wife, Sibylla Wrighton Masters. He even got her maiden name into it. And that is why our motto is, it takes both men and women working together to set things right.
I think it's so.
All rise.
All rise. Yes, indeed. I think that what's so beautiful about this is the intentionality in every aspect that you and the team have focused on, not just the inclusion, the equity, not only just the operations of a business, not just coming alongside them and aligning the North Star with the founders. It's the holistic picture, right? And I think that's so important because I think we've all got pitched, right? Definitely for those that are listening, we've all got pitched and they focus just on one vertical. Hey, we're best in tech, AI, whatever, right? But it's this holistic approach that then you're able to win every aspect. And like you mentioned, you see the weeks and these patterns and these patterns, and you're able to say, okay, hey, in a very data driven approach, and it's so remarkable, and that's why it's so fun having a conversation with you ladies and talking about it, and also sharing it with our audience and bring this up for top of mind about the amazing arbitrage that's going on right here that a lot of people are not familiar with. So for those that want to reach out to you, to Masters Fund, to network, connect a little bit, learn a little bit more, how do they reach out to you?
Oh, GP at masters.vc. So GP, General Partners, you'll get both Anne and myself, Gillian.
Perfect. I will also put the masters.vc website down there, and the other places that you've been featured with. So I'll put that email, so it makes it very simple. And I'll put their LinkedIn as well, so you can review some of their background, their incredible background. Anne Kennedy and Gillian Musseig, I appreciate you being on here and just sharing your incredible wisdom. I have one last question for each one of you before we let you go. And I always love to ask this question because you have been very successful women, right? In your own right, in your own way. And I'll go with you, Anne, and then I'll go to you, Gillian. What insecurities did you have to overcome to become the successful woman that you are now?
Oh my God. All of them. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't know enough about math. I should also, in full disclosure, I have dyslexia. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I realized that that is actually a superpower, not something I had to overcome. And because dyslexic minds work a little bit differently, but that was a significant insecurity of understanding I was neurodiverse. My mind worked differently from conventional thinking. And it turns out it's actually better to work differently from conventional thinking.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So I would say the same. Young girls are not treated in the same way as young boys, especially when we grew up in the 50s and so on. Perhaps there is a better treatment now as the next generation grows up, and that's important. So there were all of the insecurities of you cannot, you should not, you must not, and so on. But I would think that it was work. There's entrepreneurship of necessity and entrepreneurship of opportunity. And I think perhaps like many women, Anne and I came to this as entrepreneurship of necessity. We needed to do this, and so we did what we could with what we had, and built it from, if you will, rubble and scrabble, to make what we could. And the fact that we were able to break out into entrepreneurship of opportunity was really a gift. And I tend to focus more on that than on what held me back at this point. I am mindful that I grew up essentially in Harlem, in New York City, kind of the northern tip of that. And my colleagues who were Caucasian also became, how should I say, the doctors, the lawyers, and the Indian chiefs, right? But those who were not, the people of color, those who were in Spanish Harlem, those who were African American, and so on, many of them, most of them did not, right? We all grew up dirt poor. Some of us got out. And I have no doubt that it was simply the color of my skin. And so just as we look at the women who are getting less, significantly less money in venture capital because of their physical body being female, we have to be aware that the color of the skin is still a massive asset or detriment in the United States. And I know that I was just, how should I say, just born that way. And just being aware of it has helped me to be aware of what is possible, and then to help make that possible for a whole lot more people.
Well, thank you, ladies, for being authentic and vulnerable, sharing those things that you have overcome and to be the successes that you are now. Ladies and gentlemen, those are my friends at Managing Director at Masters Fund, Anne Kennedy and Gillian Musseig. Guys, that a Journey with Christian David's podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can. Gillian, Anne, that was a lot of